Mark 2:23 through 3:6. One Sabbath he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him?" And he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks, Lexi. What we've been up to around here for the past few weeks and what we will continue to do up until the start of the summer has been to look at the Gospel of Mark, the first 8 chapters of the Gospel of Mark. It's the earliest, oldest gospel account, written account that we have of the life of Jesus that we know of. And what's fascinating about the first 8 chapters of the Gospel of Mark is that they really are oriented all around trying to answer one fundamental question, which is, who is Jesus? Who is this person that has made such a splash in the world? Who really was he? Who is he? And so we're looking at these stories for ourselves, these firsthand accounts, so that you and I might also have an answer to that question. And our hope is that maybe as we look at this, maybe some of you will come to a fresh answer for that question. But our passage we're going to look at this morning, it's really the culmination. It's the breaking point of all of this conflict that has been brewing underneath the surface between Jesus and the Pharisees, which is kind of the religious leaders of Jesus' day. If you go back to the beginning of Mark chapter 2, and you just read story after story, there are 5 stories back to back where Jesus is just going toe to toe with the religious leaders, and you get to this passage, which is really 2 stories, but it all kind of culminates with tempers flaring, with Jesus taking the gloves off, with it just being this like throwdown, and you get to the very end, verse 6 of chapter 3, and it culminates with an assassination plot. Like things got really intense. We're only in chapter 3, and people are already talking about, we got to kill this dude. So here's the question. What is it about these particular conversations that are so charged and so intensified to where people really are concluding, we have to murder this man? And I think the reason is because in this passage, Jesus is pressing on something in the human heart that we do not want him to press on. There's something so deeply embedded in the human heart that if it gets exposed, if it gets challenged, we want to fight. It is well-defended territory in the human heart. We clench our teeth, we clench our fist. We were not touching that. And that thing that I'm talking about that Jesus starts pressing on is our moralism. Moralism is when you take the rules and then life becomes about the rules. When people exist for the rules. And so what I want to do is just kind of explore why Jesus has such a problem with moralism. Really just 2 big ideas I want to look at with this passage. First, we're going to look at the features of moralism. What is it? What does it look like? And then we'll look at the healing of moralism. The features of it and then the healing of it. The features. There's 3 features in this passage that I think you'll see that I want to draw your attention to. Here's the first one. The first feature of moralism is that moralism creates rules. It is a moralistic impulse to want to create rules for yourself and for others. So let's look at this passage. Like I said, this is actually 2 stories together. I tried to separate them with a little break in your bulletin so that you could make sense of it. But both of these stories take place on the Sabbath day, which is going to be a very important detail as we try to make sense of this. But if you look at the first story is that Jesus and his disciples are walking through a field, a grain field. And his disciples are taking the heads of grain, just kind of plucking off the heads and then popping them in their mouth. It's just like having a snack. But if you look at verse 24, it says, and the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? In other words, they see that they are doing something that should not be being done. They're doing something wrong. They should not be picking grain on the Sabbath. And here's why. Here's what's going on in their mind. Is when God gave his people his moral law, which is summarized in the 10 Commandments, the 4th commandment of the Big Ten was about the Sabbath day. It was about taking one day out of 7 to not work. Work 6 days, don't work 7th day. Fair enough. But when you think about it, it's kind of vague. What does work mean? So the religious leaders of the day came up with a bunch of rules to really try to get at the specifics of, okay, how do you know if you're working? How do you know if you're not working? So a couple examples. They said, you can't lift anything heavier than a dried fig, which is about the size of an egg. Because if you lift anything heavier than that, you're doing heavy lifting, you're exerting yourself. So, but a dried fig, that's fine. But everything else, work. They said on the Sabbath day, you are not allowed to spit. Because if you spit on the ground, on the dirt, and there happens to be a seed underneath that dirt and it gets germinated because of the moisture in your saliva, you're farming. It's considered farming. And so you could have somebody who says, I'm not working, I'm just watering the lawn, I'm just spitting. And they said, you can't do that. No spitting on the Sabbath day. So when the disciples are walking along and they're just kind of grabbing grain, the Pharisees do not see this as just grabbing a snack. They see this as harvesting. You are harvesting the fruit of the field. Not allowed. Not okay. Moralism has this, impulse to create rules. But look at the second story. Jesus is in a synagogue, which would have been, like a church service, kind of like this. It would have been a smaller room, but, synagogue was like a religious gathering. And someone in the crowd, it says that they have a withered hand. We don't really know exactly what that means, but his hand was damaged, sort of like Dumbledore in Book 6. And everybody, it says in verse 2 of chapter 3, everyone is watching Jesus intently because they know that dude's got a messed up hand in the crowd, and they know Jesus is likely going to try to do something. And so they're looking to see, is he going to heal him? Is he going to provide medical attention to somebody on the Sabbath? Because one of the rules that they had was you cannot provide medical attention to someone on the Sabbath unless their life is in danger. And a kind of a hurt hand is not, your life's not in danger. So they're wondering, is he going to do it? Is he going to work? Is he going to put on his doctor hat and go into the office on the Sabbath and work and break the rules? Here's the point. Nowhere in the Bible does it say you can't pluck heads of grain in a grain field on the Sabbath. Nowhere in the Bible does it say you can't provide medical attention to somebody who might need it on the Sabbath. But these folks had created all of these extra rules to make sure that we know that we're following the rules and we know who the people who are not following the rules are. That's the impulse of moralism. Moralism is this impulse inside of every human heart that wants to create more rules. Give you an example from my life. Superficial example, but I believe deeply in my soul there is a right way to load the dishwasher. And there is a right, this is where the coffee cups go. They go on this aisle because there's more room for the little handle to stick out. This is where the bowls go so that the thing doesn't flop over. This is where the plastic cups go. I know, I've got problems. But when my children load the dishwasher, never mind the wonder that they put their dirty dishes in the dishwasher. I overlook that and just get sometimes annoyed because that's not where the bowl goes. The bowl goes in the bowl aisle. Do they know that I have this insane framework in my head? No. But that's an impulse of moralism. Moralism is this impulse that wants to say there is a right way to do this and there's a wrong way to do this. Give you some more examples. Moralism says there is a right way to vote. How can you consider yourself a Christian and not vote for my person? How can you consider yourself an American and not vote for my person? Moralism says there is a right way to educate your children. You must not care about your kids then if you send them to Memphis public schools. Or you must not care about the city if you send them to private schools. Moralism says there is a right way to think about Venezuela. There's a right way to think about Palestine and Israel. There's a right way to think about Charlie Kirk. There's a right way to think about fill in the blank. Here's the point. Here's what I want you to see. Religious people do not have a monopoly on moralism. It is alive and well in every single human being. We have this impulse that we want to add and create more rules so that we know we're the good ones. And we also know who are the bad ones. Everything from as serious, as important global events in our day, down to something that is so trivial, like when is the appropriate amount of time of when you should respond with a thank you note? We've got rules around that. That's the first impulse. Moralism creates rules. Here's the second feature of moralism. Moralism weaponizes rules. We create the rules and then we weaponize them. Look back at the passage. If you go to the first story, the disciples are walking along. They're minding their business. They're eating the grain. And in verse, verse 24, the Pharisees say, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And I've always found this story a little bit comical because they're in a field. Where did the Pharisees even come from? Were they hiding behind bushes and just popped out and said, "Look, they're doing it. They're eating it." But here's the point. Moralism turns you into a human surveillance system where you got a whistle around your neck and you're just looking who's going to say the wrong thing, who's going to do the wrong thing, and you're just so ready to blow the whistle. In fact, you see this so clearly in the second story. Look at verse 2. When they're in the synagogue, it says they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath. So why? So that they might be astounded that someone was just healed in front of them? No, it says so that they might accuse him. Moralists are always surveilling, looking for violators to the rules, not so that those violators might be given grace and mercy, but so that those violators might be accused, punished, judged. I recently read that there was a group of comedians that were talking about the fact that they no longer want to perform stand-up comedy on college campuses. And they were explaining why. Here's what Chris Rock said in this article I read. He said, quote, "I stopped playing colleges. And the reason is because the students are way too conservative. Not in their political views, not like they're voting Republican, but in their social views and their willingness not to offend anybody." Jerry Seinfeld said something similar. He said, "The younger generation just wants to use these words. That's racist, that's sexist, that's prejudice. I don't play colleges, but I hear a lot of people tell me don't go near colleges. They're so PC. Now, do with that what you will, but here's what I find interesting about that is colleges, the college campus, universities in our country, these are like the bastions of liberalism and open thought. And you've got these comedians that are like, no, they're not. They are extremely dogmatic and judgmental and just as conservative as the most fundamentalist, conservative, traditional religion out there. That's fascinating. Why is that? Moralism. It's this moralistic impulse to say there are words that you may not say, and there are subjects that you may not joke about. And if you do, violators will be punished. You will be labeled. You will be canceled. The rules get weaponized. I'll give you a little bit more down to kind of our backyard sort of example. My wife, Catherine, a couple of months ago, was talking with one of our neighbors here in Midtown, just talking about the kids, school, catching up. And the neighbor that was talking to my wife, at one point, Catherine said she kind of like was looking over her shoulders and leaned forward and whispered that she was sending her kids next year to a school in East Memphis. And Catherine was like, why are you being so secretive? And she said, because as I have told other neighbors about this, I have felt the judgment. Because apparently for some people there's a rule, thou shalt not send your kids to any other school other than a Midtown school, and violators will be punished. And she felt, it's a silly example, but it was real. It's a real story. She felt the judgment. She was breaking a rule. I think this is one of the reasons why there are so many just horror stories and statistics of people that have left the church, or been burned by the church, been hurt by the church, deconstructing from their faith. Because it is low-hanging fruit in a religious space to weaponize the rules. And you can just show up in a religious space or show up in a church and just have a dump truck of guilt backed up against you. It's just, you're not doing enough. You don't have enough faith. How dare you how dare you do that? How dare you think that? You feel like it's just the rules are weaponized. And the church kind of functions like a religious police state at that point. And that's not fun. So moralists, they create rules and then weaponize the rules. And then here's the third feature. They privilege the rules, meaning that the rules get privileged over actual people, human beings. Go back to the first story. Here's how Jesus responds. They jump out of the bushes. They say, why are they doing what's not lawful? And Jesus tells this story. He cites this story that shows up in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, about David. When David was on the run for his life, he was nomadic. He was hiding in caves for years and years and years. And it says at one point he shows up into the house of God, and there were these special loaves of bread that were set out on the table. And these loaves were reserved only to be eaten by the priests. David wasn't a priest, but he eats the bread. And he didn't get in trouble for it. He didn't get judged for it. And Jesus says, you know why? Verse 25, because he was in need. He was hungry. And he's saying, hey, there are rules that allow certain things, don't allow certain things. And sometimes there's situations where there's extenuating circumstances. And people have real needs. And so in that moment, who are you going to prioritize? Are you going to prioritize the rules? Or are you going to prioritize people? Same sort of situation in the next story. That moralism privileges the rules over people. Here they're in the synagogue, and you've got Dumbledore, hand guy, and here's what Jesus does in this scenario, which I think is amazing. Look at verse 3. It says, he said to the man with the withered hand, come here. The Greek there means come up here, meaning Jesus is inviting this guy to come out of the crowd, and I want you to stand in the middle so everybody can see you, which is Jesus' way of forcing the issue. And he asks these people that are watching him, seeing if he's going to do anything. Look what he says in verse 4. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to harm, to save life or to kill? In other words, he says, let's think about what the Sabbath is. The Sabbath is this gift that God has given us for our rest and for our refreshment and for us to be revived. It is a day that we are supposed to get back in touch with life. So let's ask, what is lawful? What is really lawful on a day like today? Would it be to heal this man and to do something and provide life for him? Or is it to do nothing and to harm him? And it says they don't say anything. They're just silent. And look at verse 5. Jesus looks around at them with anger. He is furious because they have so missed this one. They have so prioritized the rules over people, and it's driving Jesus crazy. It's almost like a scenario where, let's say that you hurt your leg. You're sawing wood and you saw your leg and you're bleeding everywhere and you're bleeding out and you're losing consciousness, and a friend puts you in the car and they race you to, down the street. They're racing you to the pit. They're taking you to the ER. But you get pulled over before you can get there because your friend was speeding. And it's like the cop has to make a choice. It's like, okay, you broke the rule. You broke the no speeding rule. So your friend has to sit there and, you have to sit there and bleed out while I write you a ticket for a few minutes. Or are you going to prioritize people and the needs? The reason why Jesus is so furious is because moralism does this thing to our hearts where it privileges the rules over people, which is such a dangerous, dangerous impulse in our hearts, where we can say, okay, if someone really breaks the rule, if they really violate my code, I don't have to love them. I mean, that's why Jesus is mad at these Pharisees, is because they have manipulated the rules in such a way where they don't have to love this guy with the messed up hand. Moralism says what matters are the rules, and if you break the rules, I don't have to love you. Let's think of this. Let's say you have a friend who thinks Donald Trump hung the moon. And they were all up into Fox News, and they got all the MAGA swagga, and that's just who they are. And in your mind, it's deplorable. They've broken so many rules by even just endorsing this. Do you still have to love that person? Moralism would say no. Jesus would say, yeah. Or you think of the alternative. Let's say you have a friend with somebody who just thinks Donald Trump's the Antichrist, and they're all up into CNN, all up into MSNBC, and they've got the rainbow flag in their yard, and they're just totally opposed to everything about this administration. And you think that is deplorable. How can they consider themselves Americans? They've broken all the rules. Do you have to love that person? Again, moralism says, no, you don't. They broke the rules. And Jesus would say, you do. Do you have to love a racist? What about a narcissist? What about someone who really has hurt you? Have they broken a rule in such a way where they're now disqualified from love? Well, we know what moralism would say. We know what Jesus would say. Here's where we have to really be careful with this, and I felt this in my own being as I was preparing for this morning, because I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about all this stuff and thinking about all these examples, and I'm just starting to think, man, moralists, they're the worst. They're so judgy. And I started to feel it in myself. So slippery. There it is. They broke the no moralist rule. Oh, well, there it is. You know, once you see this kind of moralistic impulse inside of you, I have a friend who says once you see it, it's like chicken pox. It's all over you. You can't unsee it. So what do? Let's look at the healing of our moralism. Spend a lot of time on the features. We'll be briefer here. Let's look at the second story. Here you got this man with a withered hand. He cannot heal himself. He cannot fix himself. No amount of rule keeping is going to fix it. No amount of Sabbath keeping is going to fix it. He's hopeless in terms of his hand. And look at what Jesus says to the man in verse 5. He says, stretch out your hand, which I think is a very intentional choice of words. If you go to the spot, one of the spots in the Hebrew Scriptures where God gives the 10 Commandments, Deuteronomy chapter 5, when you read the commandment of the fourth commandment, which, by the way, I put it in your bulletin, listen to what God says at the end of this commandment for why you should keep the Sabbath. This is so fascinating. He says, keep the Sabbath, observe it, 6 days, take 1 day off, because, second to last sentence, the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. God's redemption is described as a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. The Pharisees are so concerned about keeping the Sabbath and not working, but they have completely missed the whole story of the Sabbath. The whole story of the Sabbath is embodied in this man with the withered hand. He doesn't have a mighty hand. He doesn't have an outstretched arm. He cannot save himself. He cannot fix himself. He has to rely on the mighty hand and outstretched arm of God to do for him what he cannot do for himself. That's the spirit of the Sabbath. Moralism looks at the rules and says, I don't need help. I don't need your mighty hand. I got it. I got this. I'll do it. I'll jump through the hoops. I'll prove that I'm a good person, and I don't need your mercy. I don't need your charity. I got this. You know what moralism requires? Moralism requires strength and work. And Jesus is trying to show through this man, the Sabbath requires weakness and rest. Here's what's so fascinating. If you get to chapter 3, verse 6, the religious leaders, they leave the scene and they just start hatching a murder plot. And irony of ironies is here's this day given by God that they seem to care a whole lot about, given by God for our life, and they spend their Sabbath trying to figure out how to murder someone. You see how twisted moralism can get you, where you're just like, I really care about grains of heads of grain, and I don't care about human beings. Spoiler alert, I don't want to spoil the end of the story, but they succeed. They arrest Jesus, and they hang him up on a cross where his arms are outstretched. And he bears all of the burdens, all of the weight of our materialism and our judgment, and it all gets put on him. And you know what Jesus cries out when his arms are outstretched? He cries out, "It is finished," meaning all the rule keeping that was required for your salvation, I've accomplished. The entire debt that was required for all of your rule breaking, I've paid for. I've done it all. I've done 100%. It is 1,000% done. All you must do now is come and rest. Rest in the love and the grace of my outstretched arms on your behalf. Get off the hamster wheel of trying to justify your very existence and come and simply rest. This is why Jesus refers to himself in verse 28 of chapter 2, the Lord of the Sabbath. He is the only one who can really provide us with the rest, the Sabbath that our souls need. Final thought. It is exhausting being a moralist. I don't know about you, but everyone that I talk to, if you can get them to talk past, how are you doing? Good, fine, busy. You get maybe 2 seconds, 2 more sentences in, everyone will tell you they're tired. And we're all tired. That's why you walk into you're the church, you're like, give me the coffee. We're exhausted. We're all exhausted of trying to secure the life that we want for ourselves. We're exhausted of trying to justify our lives to everybody on the internet. We're exhausted of trying to figure out and make sense of our own stories and our own diet and our own parenting and our own work relationships. We're on this hamster wheel, and it is exhausting. And here is Jesus, the Lord of the Sabbath, and he says the gospel invites you to a better way. Invites you to get off the hamster wheel, trying to justify your own existence, and rest your weary soul in me, who justifies you by grace. I did all the work. You don't have to. You can just come and be at home in my love. And that is very sweet news. Let me pray for us. Oh, Father, would you draw us deeper into the mighty hands and the outstretched arms of your Son, who lived the life that we should have lived, and who died the death that we should have died, and who did everything from A to Z, the Alpha and the Omega, accomplished every square inch of what was required on our behalf so that we might be liberated. We might be healed of our moralism. We might walk a different path. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.